Okay, so let's try and unpack this. Imagine one of the most consequential, bloodiest events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. But what if it wasn't the inevitable climax of a historical class struggle? What if it was, instead, a disaster triggered by a geopolitical catastrophe, governmental blunders, and then successfully exploited by a small, ruthless minority? That controversial, really powerful reframing is the central argument of the book we're getting into today. And we want you to discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Unlike our previous review, which offers a more focused analysis, this feature delivers a comprehensive overview, tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, please let us know. Your feedback will help shape future content.
We are thrilled to guide you through this complex, just foundational moment in modern history. And for those curious about how we synthesize this much detail, we've collaborated on this analysis.
That's right. And you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, and it lets us create deeper, more dynamic book summaries. We've pulled key documents and arguments directly from the text.
And today we're focused on Sean McMeekin's really substantial 2017 work, The Russian Revolution, A New History. It's a detailed narrative political history. It's intended for a serious but general readership, and it was published to coincide with the centenary of 1917.
The mission here is crystal clear. McMeekin wants to dismantle that whole idea of inevitability. He traces the chaotic path from the Romanov monarchy to the establishment of Bolshevism, and he emphasizes contingency at every single turn. He argues that World War I, catastrophic government incompetence, the resulting army breakdown, and, crucially, Bolshevik opportunism. Those are the true drivers. We're tracking events from the twilight of the Romanov Empire right up through the brutal early 1920s Civil War.
To understand how the Tsarist state fell so quickly, we have to grasp the inherent contradictions of late imperial Russia. McMeekin sets the scene geographically, reminding us that this wasn't just happening in Petrograd. This was the vast Eastern Front, essential railway lines, foreign capitals like Berlin, and key provincial centers.
And the social fabric was just tearing apart. You had this explosive, rapid industrialization creating a massive, concentrated urban working class. But it was coexisting very uneasily with deep structural peasant poverty, the vast majority of the population. And that led to a political radicalization that was just simmering right beneath the surface.
Right, and the structural weaknesses of the Romanov autocracy were completely exposed, starting with the 1905 revolution. McMeekin details that as the first major crack in the system. While Nicholas II did institute the Duma and allowed for a kind of constitutional experiment, he did it reluctantly. He was constantly restricting its powers. The Tsar's own limited capacity for political modernization really ensured that the reforms never truly satisfied anyone.
What's surprising, and what the book carefully lays out, is the economic status. Older views often paint pre-war Russia as universally backward. McMeekin argues that right before World War I, Russia's industrial output and economic growth actually appeared quite robust, maybe even stronger than many traditional accounts suggest.
Yes, but that economic muscle was housed in an extraordinarily fragile political skeleton. Nicholas II simply wasn't built for the new world of mass politics and, crucially, total war. The autocracy, it lacked the necessary mediating institutions, strong political parties, an independent press, a robust civil society to absorb the shocks that were about to hit.
And those shocks arrived with World War I. The book emphasizes that the pressure of mass mobilization, we're talking millions of men pulled into uniform, combined with catastrophic military losses and continuous supply breakdowns, it immediately started tearing the legitimacy of the monarchy to shreds. The fact that the Tsar took personal command of the army only tied the military failure directly to the crown.
The casualties were staggering, and the economic management of the war effort was abysmal. This strain immediately amplified worker unrest in the cities and peasant discontent in the countryside. It provided exactly the fertile ground that underground revolutionary groups, especially the Bolsheviks, needed. They didn't have to convince people the system was terrible. The system was proving it for them daily in the barracks and factories.
And we can't forget the internal rot at the court. The influence of the German-born Empress Alexandra and her reliance on these dubious court circles, like Rasputin, well, it added a layer of profound mistrust and scandal. When the political center is viewed by the populace and critically by the elite as incompetent, spiritually corrupt, the state effectively loses its moral right to command before the revolution even starts.
And that political rot, it just laid the foundation for the explosion of 1917.
So we move into the year of revolution. February happens almost spontaneously. How does McMeekin treat the collapse?
He describes the February Revolution not as a deep, organized plot, but as a rapid-fire chain of events rooted in desperation. You have bread riots, massive worker demonstrations, the local military garrisons mutinying, and, most crucially, the key elite defections in the Duma and the High Command. These forces combined and just shattered Tsarist authority within days, forcing Nicholas II's abdication.
And that immediate aftermath created a political nightmare. It basically ensured instability. The book carefully outlines the formation of the Provisional Government, which was composed mainly of liberal and moderate politicians, existing right alongside the Petrograd Soviet of workers' and soldiers' deputies. This was the moment of dual power.
And if we want to understand the failure of 1917, we have to understand the mechanics of dual power. It was chronic paralysis. The Provisional Government had the formal authority in the ministries. But the Soviet, thanks to things like Order Number 1, controlled the loyalty of the vital Petrograd garrison, the railways, and the factories.
All right, so the government could issue a decree, but the Soviet could issue a counter-directive. And that effectively crippled the state's ability to govern or enforce any policy. Provisional government leaders, like the moderate Alexander Kerensky, were trying to hold the state together and maintain Russia's commitment to the war. They believed the war effort was necessary for national honor and allied aid.
And that commitment was their Achilles heel. The unresolved questions, ending the war, distributing land, restoring order, were paralyzing the government. Unlike the Bolsheviks, they felt bound by parliamentary procedure and their wartime alliances.
And this instability was the vacuum Vladimir Lenin was built to fill. If McMeekin argues this wasn't inevitable, what traditional view of Lenin is he actively trying to dismantle?
Well, he dismantles the idea that Lenin was simply waiting for the inevitable Marxist historical moment. Instead, McMeekin portrays him as an uncompromising political opportunist who recognized that the chaos of the war and dual power, offered a unique, very narrow window. His strategic genius lay in his radical simplicity. He returned from exile and immediately pushed for revolution. He campaigned relentlessly against the imperialist war and used these powerful, resonant slogans, peace, land, and bread, which were demands the masses understood and the moderates simply couldn't deliver.
The power of a simple, direct promise. It just can't be overstated in times of desperation. As we watch the moderate forces struggle against this tide of radical simplicity and growing chaos, let's just pause for a mindful moment. Check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, inspiring reflection and rational thought. We encourage you to use this information to pause and reflect on the dynamics of political collapse.
So, back to the action in 1917. The Provisional Government was on borrowed time, weakened by its inability to solve those basic, immediate problems. McMeekin highlights two key ruinous moments that drastically helped the Bolshevik cause that summer and autumn. First, the failed July Days Uprising, where the Bolsheviks miscalculated.
And second, and maybe most devastating, was the Kornilov affair. This was the general's attempted military coup against the Provisional Government.
Precisely. That debacle wasn't just a political challenge, it was a disaster for the moderates. Kerensky, in his desperation to defeat Kornilov, had to turn to the Soviets, and specifically, the armed Bolshevik units for defense. This single act discredited the moderates entirely. It suggested they couldn't even defend the capital. And at the same time, it unintentionally handed weapons and immense political legitimacy to the Bolsheviks, making them appear as the decisive, necessary force against counter-revolution.
So, step by step, the Bolshevik organizers, Trotsky, Lenin, and others, built strength in the military units and Soviets, positioning themselves for the final decisive move. And that move is what the book characterizes as a highly coordinated, technical, hostile takeover, rather than a true popular uprising.
That's a critical distinction. The October seizure was a relatively quiet, coordinated operation. It was carried out by a small, disciplined force against specific, strategic points in Petrograd railway stations, telegraph offices, government centers. McMeekin emphasizes it was successful because it exploited the vast confusion, the total exhaustion of the populace, and the divided, disorganized opposition. It was swift political and military opportunism, not a spontaneous, broad mandate from the country.
And after that seizure in the capital, the entire nature of the state changes overnight. Let's trace the immediate steps of Bolshevik rule and the early decrees that defined the regime.
The initial priority was securing power by addressing those immediate popular demands. They issued decrees on land, confiscating property, and handing it to peasant committees, and on the press, immediately suppressing rival parties and publications. Crucially, they pushed forward on ending Russia's role in the war, which resulted in the devastating, punitive Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. It cost Russia massive amounts of territory.
But seizing the capital did not mean securing the country. The Bolsheviks had control of the center, but opposition forces, old Tsarist loyalists, liberals, other anti-Bolshevik socialists, they quickly coalesced. The book then traces the immediate onset of the brutal, multi-front Civil War Red forces against the White forces, complicated by foreign interventions.
The conflict quickly descended into a struggle for survival, leading to an intense and sustained brutalization of politics and society, and it was characterized by immense terror on both sides. To survive and fight this war, the Bolsheviks imposed war communism.
We mentioned the term earlier, but we need to understand what this meant for ordinary people. Tell us about the system of war communism and its profound impact.
It was a system of survival economics driven entirely by coercion. This meant the immediate, mandatory requisitioning of all surplus grain from the peasantry, often called prodrasvyoska, along with the forced militarization of labor and extremely tight central control over all industry. The goal was simple: feed the Red Army and the key industrial centers at any cost.
And the cost was enormous.
It caused widespread resistance and deepened famine across the country, arguably worsening an already desperate situation. Yet, despite the catastrophic human toll, and McMeekin makes clear the suffering was immense, the centralized, disciplined nature of the Bolshevik regime allowed them to outlast and defeat the disorganized, geographically separated white forces. By the early 1920s, the new regime was established, but the price paid in human life and social freedom was staggering.
If we pull back from the specific narrative, what are the thematic takeaways that listeners should carry away from this history?
The book offers a really searing look at three primary themes. First, state collapse, just how quickly institutions can unravel under stress. Second, the devastating and uniquely radicalizing impact of modern total war on domestic politics. And third, the sheer ability of a disciplined, radical minority armed with simple, resonant slogans and a willingness to use maximal coercion to capture and hold power in a crisis-ridden society.
And central to that opportunism is the international dimension McMeekin stresses. The book doesn't let us forget the role of foreign actors, specifically German authorities and diplomats who, during World War I, well, they calculated that they had a clear, cynical advantage in supporting or at least facilitating Bolshevik activities.
Exactly. By allowing Lenin to return and potentially funding certain activities, the Germans saw the perfect tool to weaken their eastern enemy. They could take Russia out of the war effort, free up divisions for the Western Front. This international cynicism is really integral to McMeekin's narrative of contingency. The revolution was a localized event with massive global inputs.
Let's shift briefly to the book's narrative style, which makes such dense history manageable. It's not a theoretical tract, it's a narrative political history.
Exactly. The style is fast-paced, almost day by day in places, and incredibly detailed. McMeekin focuses on concrete actions. The order given, the arrests made, the specific routes troop trains followed, what was said at meetings. It's the voice of a third-person historian who prioritizes action and evidence over abstract theoretical debates, using concise explanations and direct quotes.
And that focus on concrete detail is heavily supported by archival research. McMeekin's work combines military history and political biography, making heavy use of specific documents to bolster his revisionist claims about opportunism and external factors.
Yes, he reconstructs key operations using diplomatic cables, newly available government decrees, and importantly, financial records. Discussing Bolshevik funding, especially the foreign transfers, allows him to reconstruct precisely how these political campaigns and maneuvers were executed on the ground. He links the money directly to the movements.
He also uses specific settings, not just abstract concepts. We are placed on military fronts, on railway lines, inside barracks, and in specific ministries to emphasize where the decisions and confrontations actually occurred. It grounds the immense scale of the revolution in human interactions.
The book's overall reception places it as a substantial revisionist-leaning narrative. Its critical value to you, the reader, lies in its intense focus on immediate causes and consequences. It challenges anyone who views 1917 as some historical certainty, forcing you to confront the reality that immense destabilizing crises often allow radical minority movements to triumph, not because of a popular mandate, but because of superior organization and ruthless action.
To bring us back to our opening thought, McMeekin presents the Russian Revolution not as historical fate, but as a crisis that was successfully exploited moment by moment.
And if we connect this interpretation to the bigger picture, the most chilling insight might be how deeply the success of the Bolsheviks, a radical minority movement dedicated to a maximal program, was intertwined with the destructive, immense geopolitical catastrophe of World War I. It suggests that immense global conflict is the ultimate breeding ground for a radical seizure of power.
A truly sobering and powerful re-examination of 20th century history. Thank you for this deep analysis. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.